Hi everybody, welcome to our webinar today titled The Board's Role in Workplace Performance and Wellbeing. My name is Sean McDonald and I shall be your moderator for the next 45 minutes. Firstly, thank you for attending today. We always appreciate the effort you make to be here for our live events. And during the session, if you have any questions, if you could please use the Q&A button on your toolbar. We'll be answering as many of these as we have time for. Finally, of course, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a very special treat for you. By answering our short 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win our beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those not too familiar with BoardPro, we are a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal. And we serve just over 40,000 users around the world across about 34 different countries these days. We enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively and efficiently with clever software, of course, with less time and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we are a software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. And one of the ways we help achieve this mission is to run the many free webinars that we put on every week and the programs that we present to you. Now, the slides from today's session, including a recording of the webinar and the transcript, will be sent to you via email tomorrow. So just sit back and relax and ask as many questions as you would like. As I said before, we'll try to get through as many of those questions as we have time for. Now, I am going to let Lloyd introduce himself and then pass over to our other panelists. Over to you, Lloyd.
Kia ora, Sean. So my name is Lloyd Mander. I lead Diversity of Thought Scorecard, or DOT Scorecard. We're a research consultancy that works with boards and leadership teams to measure diversity of thought and develop a productive decision-making culture. Now, for me, an enabling work environment is really essential to actually realizing diverse thinking. So this is a topic that's close to my heart. I also serve as advisory board chair for the Centre for Good Work, which focuses on making evidence-based knowledge on workplace performance and wellbeing accessible for organizations and workplaces through consultancy and research collaborations. And it's certainly my privilege to facilitate this session. I'd like to welcome our first panelist. So Georgia Henry, would you be kind enough to tell us a bit about you?
Thanks, Lloyd. My organisation is called Henry Reid. We're organisational culture and leadership specialists. And for the past 8 years, we've been working with many diverse boards and organisations to help them understand the opportunities and risks that are present within their organisation culture and help them create culture and leadership capability to enable the achievement of organisational outcomes. So talking about this topic today, the board's role in performance and wellbeing, very much is grounded in organisation culture and leadership, and more is regulated, particularly in Australia. So it's a really important focus for boards. So thanks, Lloyd, and enjoying being part of the panel.
Fantastic, Georgia. Now, to get to know you and the topic a little bit better, we're going to play a quick game that we call Overrated or Underrated. So for those that are not familiar, what we do is we're going to give Georgia a topic. It could be a name or a thing. I'm going to ask her whether it is overrated, i.e. it's given too much esteem or too much attention, or it's underrated, so it's not given enough acknowledgement perhaps. She may not say that something is correctly rated, so it's only overrated, underrated. She doesn't have any opportunity to explain why she's given that response. Okay, Georgia, you ready to go?
Sure.
Number 1, the vocation of HR or human resources.
Without giving explanation, that's a hard one.
No explanation.
Underrated.
Thank you. Board committees tasked with people and culture.
Underrated.
Australia's Queensland, your official colour, maroon.
Oh, come on. um, Underrated. It's
Underrated,
fantastic.
3 in a row for underrated today. Thank you very much, Georgia. That's told us a little bit about you and about, which is fantastic to know. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Katerina Naswell, who I'm going to ask to introduce yourself. So tell us a bit about you.
Thanks, Lloyd. Kia ora koutou. Hi, everyone. My name is Katerina Naswell. I'm a professor in organisational psychology at University of Canterbury, and I'm the co-director of the Centre for Good Work, together with Professor Sanna Malinen in the business school here. What it means that I'm in organisational psychology means that we research and teach in how to make organisations better for people and for the organisations themselves. So really looking forward to this conversation about how the boards can participate in that ambition. Thanks.
Welcome and thank you. Now, Katharina, you get to play the same game. You've seen how it's played. So here's your first topic. It is mindfulness. Overrated or underrated?
Maybe I'm gonna. Oh, that's tough. I'm indecisive. Overrated.
Thank you. Now you'll be familiar with this perhaps more than some of our participants today. Multi-level regression analysis. So this is used to analyze data in a hierarchical or nested structure where data points are grouped or clustered within multiple levels. So multi-level regression analysis, is it overrated or underrated?
Underrated.
Underrated, thank you. And you originally from Sweden, you completed your PhD in Stockholm. So your final topic is Stockholm Syndrome, which is the proposed psychological condition where a captive develops an emotional bond with their captor. Is Stockholm Syndrome overrated or underrated?
Overrated.
Overrated, okay. Thank you very much. Now, Katharina, we're going to ask you now to begin with our next slide. Thank you, Sean. We've just to take us through some current perspectives on workplace wellbeing and performance, and the kind of things that the people are saying and people are thinking.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me to talk about this. My favorite topic, so it's a good topic to talk about. Just to set us off with a couple of quotes around how people are thinking about the relationship between well-being and performance. And the first quote, sort of going clockwise, is from a recent piece in The Conversation about how the productivity problem of New Zealand is actually partly due to workers not being happy at work. And I think that's a good place to start our conversation. The next one is Jeffrey Pfeffer, who has written about this for a long time around the relationship between performance and well-being, and how he says we're dying for a paycheck, but his main point is we shouldn't be. And the final quote at the bottom is organizations that are starting to realize that they can use the power of their business to contribute to building a better world. So that's sort of where I want us to get to at the end, the sort of role we all play in making things better for ourselves and each other. So I guess I'll just start talking a little bit about why I think we should all focus on well-being. And the biggest or most sort of severe one is the legal argument. And here in New Zealand, we have our Health and Safety at Work Act, which says that employers should prevent and eliminate health hazards, and health here includes mental health. In Australia, of course, there's a little bit more specifics around the psychosocial hazards in the workplace that should be managed. And I think, Georgia, you might have some input here on some recent examples.
Yeah, it's becoming so much more part of the board discussion since it has been included in the Work Health and Safety Act. But it's actually been a part of what boards should have been looking at for a long time. It has now got more prevalence when we start to look at mental health as well as physical safety. But of course, directors have not only their legal obligations and their statutory duties, but also their fiduciary duties under the Corporations Act. And that is the duty of care, which has been there and does focus on this. The main shift now is it's not okay to wait till something happens. Directors now have a proactive duty to make sure that they must take all reasonable care to eliminate psychosocial hazards and provide a workplace that is mentally healthy and safe as well. So that, of course, is much more complicated. It's harder to identify, but for me, what it comes down to is good culture and capable leadership to address that.
That's really good input, and I think that's something that will probably come back to what you just said.
Yeah.
I think a couple of more good reasons. If you need more reasons than that, then there's also the sustainable development goals that we all strive towards around good health and well-being and decent work and economic growth. But maybe even more important or more salient for businesses and boards is the business case, that it makes business sense to support mental health and well-being at work. And there's different numbers, but usually return on investment is said to be $5 for every dollar spent. Now, how that is spent can vary, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that as well. I think
Katharina, what kind of evidence can you share around that? So around different studies that have come up with those sort of numbers. What sort of evidence are they using to base it on?
That's a good question. So what they've usually done is to calculate the time lost to poor mental health. So for example, people being away from work due to sick leave or burnout. There's a lot of figures from Europe around this. There's also numbers around people coming to work when they really should have stayed home for mental health reasons, well-being reasons, and underperforming. So they're there doing the work, but it's not actually producing as much. So, and those are some concrete numbers there, but that means that there's probably a lot of data that we haven't been able to capture. Like Georgia said, it's hard to capture these things. So if we were better at measuring, we'd probably find that it was even more of a return on investment, I would expect.
Yes,
if I can jump in there as well, I was having a look at some data and particularly from the Productivity Commission in 2019. This is old data. This is nearly 10 years old data from the 2015-2016 about that says that mentally unhealthy workplaces cost Australian businesses $12.8 billion a year in absenteeism. So that's just in absenteeism. And when we look at lower productivity, we look at workers' compensation claims, we look at the other long-term impacts, the impacts that has on teams, on the organisational effectiveness, it will be much greater than that. So that's nearly 10-year-old data, but it just shows that the cost is really significant, and the mental health claims actually cost on average about 3 times of a physical claim. So when you have an accident, there's always going to be a mental health impact. When you have a physical injury, there's a mental health aspect to it, but mental health claims can happen without a physical aspect, and they are much more difficult and more timely and more costly to resolve. So being proactive in this space is really essential, and the data overwhelmingly in every way that you look supports organisational focus, and from a board level focusing on this is really essential.
Can I bring in can I bring in one of the questions? A number of questions coming through, and one of them is really, I think, on point. This is from Adrian. And this is really around that opportunity cost of we're making a case for focusing on well-being and a potential opportunity cost. So the question is there a danger that a greater focus currently on mental health could lead to an exclusion of duty and focus around physical health? I'd love for each of your perspectives on that.
I'd love to jump in on that one. I don't think so. I think physical health and physical safety is so embedded and entrenched in our ways of working now. It's been a focus for a long time. The mental health is an important aspect to ensuring physical health and physical safety. When we look at attention and focus and engagement and exhaustion or overwhelm, or these things that contribute to mental health, those impacts can certainly lead to safety incidents and accidents. So I don't believe that there is a risk there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the prevention of physical injuries and accidents starts with handling things like fatigue, stress, fear, or even creating a culture where you can ask for help if something's too heavy, or just as a simple example. So I don't think one negates the other. In fact, focusing on well-being and mental health will probably improve physical outcomes as well. So.
Agree.
Thank you. That's really great. That totally makes sense. So, Katharina, you were saying it's around general social responsibility for well-being as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of talked about this, that it just makes good sense for organizations to see themselves as part of promoting mental health and well-being in society. I think organizations that do this well, who have healthy staff, create healthy communities around them, so they become part of the solution. I'll just speak quickly to this slide. It's just some data from organizations who have tracked organizations that have high levels of well-being culture just do better on things like intentions to stay. So turnover is lower, engagement's higher. Both of these are, of course, related to productivity. Turnover is quite expensive, as we know, so reducing that, at least the voluntary part, is important. And also the days lost to absence and presenteeism that we talked about on the previous slide are fewer in a culture of well-being. So the data supports this. And like Georgia said, that there's data from 20, 30 years ago that shows this. So it's not a new thing, and it's consistent over time.
Yeah, one of the places I always look for engagement data is the Gallup Global Engagement Research, which is really interesting. And I had a look at it, the 2024 data yesterday in preparation for this, to look at the Australia and New Zealand levels of engagement. I think, as you said at the beginning, Katharina, engagement is low at the moment. And on average, when we look at the number of people in Australia and New Zealand who are actively disengaged, not yet engaged, or engaged, they're fairly similar. We've got around 12% actively disengaged, 65% not yet engaged, and 22% engaged. And this is a current workforce. So put this in a different way. If we had 20 people in a boat, in your organisation's boat, 4 would be paddling hard. They're actively engaged. 13 are along for the ride. They're not yet engaged, and that is your opportunity cost. That is where there's a risk and an opportunity. And 3 are actively trying to sink your boat. They are actively disengaged. So those figures, when you translate them from percentages to what is actually happening in your organisation, it becomes a really compelling story for we need to actually focus on engagement, on looking at days lost to absence, intentions to stay, productivity, how we're improving workplace performance and well-being to shift those figures. It's quite terrifying when you think about what's being lost in that scenario.
Lloyd, we have a number of good
can
questions.
I? Thank you, Sean.
Do you want to tackle those?
Absolutely. So just first of all, Katharina, for you, just some definitions. So first of all, well-being, and secondly, psychosocial. How would you define?
Thank you. Well-being, we define it as feeling good and functioning well. And so it's really broad. There's many, many different ways of assessing it. But at the core, it's something about having a reasonable proportion of positive emotions and doing well, doing things that are having some meaning in your life.
Okay.
And the second one was psychosocial. So this is about how you feel about things, the emotional reaction you have to things, the way that you think and feel about your work environment, rather than the physical or ergonomics, for example. So we contrast the physical to the psychosocial.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that one too. And psychosocial in the Australian legislation is actually defined as anything that will impact the psychological health of employees at work. And particularly when we look at psychosocial hazards, that can be clarity of roles and responsibilities. It can be around ways of working and expectations. It's quite broad, but it comes right to the heart of how are we actually setting people up to be successful at work? How are we meeting expectations, providing clarity, communication, sharing information? So it really goes to the heart of doing work better, like actually improving ways of working to make sure people can do their best. Because when they're in an environment that is not established, that's when people start to feel anxious or excluded or uncertain, and they start to, the productivity drops. So that psychosocial is really relates to anything in the workplace that's has the potential for psychological impact.
So given that, I've got a good question here from Larry around measuring psychosocial wellbeing. Any quick thoughts? And I know we're touching on some measures later on.
I mean, asking people about these factors that Georgia just mentioned, I think it's really important. I think it's hard to assess psychosocial work environment without some input from employees and from the group. So listening to employees, it doesn't have to be surveys, which people may or may not like, but that's a really good way to get at it, and being clear on what factors do you think are most important. So looking at the literature, there's a lot of recommendations around that. Clarity of roles, autonomy, so control over things is important, and good leadership. Those are psychosocial risk or factors that support well-being at work. So and I would also encourage anyone to measure well-being, to ask people how their well-being is, and then cross-reference that, so you get a sense of, if one factor gets better, then does well-being go up? Does it have an impact?
Now, as we move on to our next slide, there's one sort of elephant in the room question that's a really good one here, fundamental to our discussion today. Employee well-being is important, no doubt. However, is it a board topic or a management topic?
Georgia, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. What I've seen in the past is that it's been a management topic until something goes wrong. And as soon as there is crisis, the board sits up and says, well, hang on a minute, why didn't we know about this? It is a board responsibility. Board has fiduciary and statutory duties, and it is around understanding what's happening in your workforce to be able to consider that when you're making strategic decisions, when you're looking at risk in the organisation. And so quite often boards don't have great visibility of the culture of their organisation, what is happening to impact behaviours or well-being and ways of working. And so it is really a board responsibility. It's now not a nice to do, it's an obligation. And I think that's where there's this real shift in need to understand what's going on, and putting in place the right mechanisms to do that is a challenge, because boards haven't had to do this in the past. They have responded and reacted. They now have a proactive duty. So it comes down to decision making, how you're considering the impact of decisions on employee well-being and productivity, how you're identifying potential risks, how you're engaging and consulting before change and with change. All of these things have a huge impact.
Lloyd, there's a comment that's come in on chat from Wesley, which I thought I'd read out. It's really interesting. Wesley states, we've moved to a 4-day work week 2 years ago, and it's been amazing for staff, with fatigue, stress reduction, unplanned absenteeism down by 16%, productivity up, well-being all up, with 5 less staff. Focus on well-being certainly improves employee experience.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that just speaks to a caring culture that listens to what actually makes staff work better and feel better, actually has an impact. So that's really encouraging to see, I think.
And quite different to what you're introducing on the slide here, I would say.
And it's also good to note that that's not always possible for every organisation.
Yeah.
So when organisations can make that change, they will certainly reap the rewards, and there's huge benefits for everyone. But there are other things that can be done as well if you're not in a position to shift to a 4-day working week because of the nature of the work that you do. So there are a lot of options that boards need to be prepared to explore and undertake.
And I would say that 4-day work week just by itself is probably not the only thing that made the change, but that it was accompanied, or maybe there were already in place some of those good working conditions that create these opportunities for well-being and for working more productively. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide, but just Lloyd, you mentioned what's on this slide, and
Mm.
we just wanted to show what's been done in the past for well-being and what is still being done for well-being. And a lot of these things are really good. So I don't want to say that these should stop in any way, but in isolation as the only way to addressing well-being. So we talk to organizations and ask them, what do you do for well-being? And a lot of them say, well, we have stress leave days and we have EAP. And we say, well, that's great. That should absolutely be there, but it's not proactive. It's not promoting well-being. And I see a question in the chat there about whether it's about just preventing harm or if it's actually promoting positive things. And I would say promoting positive states and positive well-being will support performance, and that's where you get the benefits from this. So just recent research has shown that these employee well-being workshops, stepping contests, healthy behavior are good for some of those things, but for sustainable changes to well-being and productivity, other things need to be in place.
It's really important for the employee experience.
Yeah.
But when you look at how do you make sustainable change and build this into your culture, it has to be embedded in your governance, it has to be part of your strategy, it has to be part of your risk management approach. It has to be part of leadership capability to uphold this and reinforce it. It has to be embedded in every aspect of your employee life cycle. So it's not just about, I used to always call it the beers and barbecues, because that's what we used to hear at home. But we do Friday afternoon beers and a barbecue. Fantastic. That's not going to change what happens in the rest of the week. And so it needs to be embedded as part of your culture and ways of working.
Yeah, that we talk about the fruit bowl. That's the same as your beers and barbecue. It's great to have a fruit bowl. It's good, but it's not going to change your organizational culture.
Yeah,
we're getting quite a few questions coming through asking. So what do we do? What do we do? Knowing what we do,
let's go to the next slide.
Nice, but not enough. Let's move forward.
I'll just kick off, and then Georgia, you can chime in. I just think a few things to think about is to think about sustainable changes to workplace culture. I think the accountability at all levels is really important. Seeing the promotion of good psychosocial factors at work as a strategic goal. And I think a few things that we see consistently in the research is to prevent psychosocial hazards, which is part of the legislation, but also to help people feel better, doing better, and being better at performance. They need these three things to be in place. And it's some autonomy. It's feeling a little bit in control, not like we're just flopping around and don't have a say. Belonging, like we belong to an organization, like we're accepted for who we are, so that we're not just a number, but actually important as individuals. And competence, and having the right level of challenged professional development, feeling like we can grow and contribute and that what we do matters. So those are some things that at sort of a fundamental human level help us succeed and feel better at work. So thinking about how that can be embedded in different things. And one of the biggest things that Georgia already mentioned is leader capabilities. So creating this environment for your staff requires some skills. It requires training. It might require coaching. It might require some support, and it requires time. So investing that time so that leaders have the space to support their employees to fulfill these needs, the ABC needs, as we call them. So Georgia, I'm sure you have some comments here.
I have some comments on all of that. I agree with all of that. And I think at a board level, though, it is about actively designing and creating the culture of the organisation that is unique and fit for purpose for your organisation, that is going to enhance positive ways of working. And it does start in the boardroom with boardroom behaviours, how you interact with leaders, how are you engaging. I mean, particularly what I see in a lot of heavily for-purpose organisations, not-for-profits, where there's a huge amount of passion and commitment, is burnout at a CEO and executive level, and there's still a push for more from boards. And boards are experiencing that. A lot of volunteer boards who are doing this as a sort of an extra. How often are you stopping and having the conversation? Normalise mental health conversations. Ask the questions of your people. Are you okay? For boards, it's also really important to undertake education and understand what this means for your organisation. assess the culture of your organisation independently, so you get a realistic picture, not something that's filtered that's coming up. And consider the impact of every decision, like resource allocation, timeframes, the stress or workloads this might create on already heavily impacted organisations, the capability of your leaders in the organisation, the clarity of expectations. All of these go to psychosocial hazards. Ask questions, consult, normalise these mental health discussions. This is not happening as often as it should be at board and executive level. And I think this is a real starting point as to how do you start to bring this into the boardroom to impact your organisation moving forward.
So do I get a sense, a few questions coming through around what is the current state of board and senior management's capability and confidence in this area, that there is a ways to go. There is really quite room for improvement.
There is a way to go, because boards are time pressured. You go walk into a board meeting, you've got limited time, huge agenda, many papers to read, areas of focus, lots of statutory obligations, legal obligations. You're overwhelmed. And this is another thing that is thrown into the mix. So the level of knowledge and understanding, it is a bit of a catch-up game. However, getting this right will actually enable and resolve a lot of other things. So this is really an enabling, proactive area to focus on, which will actually help resolve a lot of issues and help make things easier moving forward.
Just one more question for you, Georgia, just around committees. So a few questions coming through around, should this sit in a committee? So should it sit in a health and safety committee? Should it sit in a people and culture committee? Do you have any thoughts around that from a structure perspective?
Look, the responsibility is the whole board's. So taking action and looking at how you're assessing the risk, it really depends on your committee structure. I've seen it sit with risk. I've seen it sit with governance. I've seen it sit with people committees. The outcome needs to be, are we addressing this? Are we meeting our obligations? Are we doing what's best for the organisation? And at board level, that's always the priority. Are we acting in the best interests of the organisation? If it sits within a committee, it needs to be coming to the board for full decisions, and it needs to be role modelled. Whatever is decided needs to be role modelled by the full board. It's actually owned by the whole board. Work can be allocated to a committee, but it's not something that I think you can delegate down to leadership teams or HR functions or a committee. It needs to be owned and role modelled by the board.
Thank you. Now, Katharina, a question for you, slightly different tact. Working from home, remote working, sort of hybrid working. So a few questions coming through around that, around, I guess evidence of have we landed somewhere on the productivity question for working from home? Like, is it equally productive, not quite as productive, more productive? That's sort of part A. And part B, where are we with the impact that might have on wellbeing? And part C, what can we do to help the well-being of those if we do have remote workers and that sort of thing to support them? So three parts to the question there. So first part, where have we landed on productivity? Second part, third part was what can we do to support them? And over to you.
Okay, so productivity, the jury's still out, but so far it seems good. Many people work if they have the option, if their job allows it. Obviously, we're not talking about people who don't have a job that can't transfer to remote, but if people have the choice of where to work, and back to the point about autonomy, if you get to choose to work where you feel the most productive and where it also fits into the rest of your life, productivity is better. That studies have shown that. And I think in our area of psychology, in management research, that we're quite agreed on that. That's not controversial to say, but that hasn't really necessarily filtered out to some businesses. I saw some comments about companies in the US who are ordering people back to work. That's not a good strategy from our perspective, because it breaks down the sense of autonomy, and it also actually limits the settings for productivity that employees might choose. People want to do well at work, and they kind of know where they do well. So So that's the first part. What was the second part? How to support well-being. I'll start with that. Back to autonomy and belonging. So we've seen that remote workers who feel disconnected from the organizations, who feel like they're forgotten about, their well-being is poor. That makes sense from what we know about the sense of belonging is really important. So working to involve employees who are remote. Now, there are fully remote organizations that work really well, where well-being is high and productivity is high. So learning from those businesses, how they create that sense of community. But if it's just one team member who's always remote and the rest aren't, that's harder. You have to work more at it. And there was a middle question, Lloyd, I think, that I've forgotten.
That's right. And I'm going to move on to another question before we tackle the points in this last slide. And that question it's one of these elephant in the room ones again. How much responsibility is the employer's responsibility, and how much is the employee's responsibility, I guess, for positively contributing to their well-being? I'd love to hear each of your perspectives on this one.
I'd love to answer that one. An employer has responsibility and a duty of care for their employees. Employees also have, we need to look after ourselves. So there's an element of self-leadership and self-responsibility. However, if someone is working in an environment where they feel unsafe, they feel unable to raise issues or concerns, or the culture is not conducive, if it's full of psychosocial hazards, there are relationship issues, there's a lack of trust, they cannot raise, it's very difficult for an employee to raise these issues. And so the responsibility does sit with the employer. The risk sits with the employer. And this is very clear under our duty of care and under our proactive duties under the legislation, that we have to be addressing this. So in a great environment and in an ideal environment, if someone is suffering any mental health impacts or detriments, you would hope that they would raise it and you could work together and be supportive. But it can be a very challenging thing for employees to do if the environment is not established to support that.
Yeah, I can chime in there, Lloyd. It's not so exciting because I'm totally agreeing, but I'm just going to reiterate a few points there. The environment, the organization, the employer creates the environment for employees to flourish, and then the employee has some responsibility to take care of themselves within that environment. But if the environment gets in the way of healthy behaviors like overwork or not being able to detach from work or having an environment that's negative in terms of interactions, that's the duty of care back to that again. So I think that's really important to remember, that the environment needs to be conducive to well-being first. It's not, you can't blame the employee if they don't feel have high well-being in an environment that doesn't support that.
Yeah. And I just want to jump in on a comment that's come up in the chat there, that seems to be a big focus on resilience workshop. I've been working with a client who has had a completely toxic environment. Employees have been suffering from trauma in the workplace. A lot of change has now happened to correct that. But one of the strategies that came from a work health and safety lead was, well, we're going to roll out all of these resilience workshops. And I'm like, I would actually say the people in your organisation are more resilient than most who have gone through what they've gone through in the last couple of years. Resilience is not going to help them. Solving the root cause of the problems is actually more focus and a greater return on investment. So I agree with that comment. The focus on resilience is, tough luck if you can't cope with the tough conditions. You'll find that most people come to work to do a good job. They then become disengaged, or they're in an environment that doesn't support success, and that then impacts their mental health and well-being. And as an employer, that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah, I'd love to comment on resilience training as well, because I saw that comment and I was keen to talk about it. I think resilience training without an organizational approach, a systemic approach to improving the environment, is borderline insulting and not very helpful. So if things are stressful, people are burning out, being on sick leave, and the only response is resilience training, it's not a positive environment. And that's focusing on healing the wounded. The research argues that the primary stuff, prevention, is both cheaper and more effective and more sustainable. So
absolutely.
that would be an argument for that. Resilience training can be good. Some people would like those tools, but it needs to be in an environment that then allows them to use those skills in a positive way. So, but I recommend probably not having so much resilience training, but focusing, and they're often quite expensive. So focusing money on upskilling leaders to support well-being instead.
Okay, Catherine, do you want to take us through just the highlights of this one here as we come towards our end point?
Well, you need to know that it's working. So especially at board level where you're interested in knowing what's going on in the organization, asking for good metrics and good evidence, I think would be key. And I saw a comment on that as well. I think how do you know what's going on? And making sure that the metrics you use actually measure what you're looking for. So clarifying what is it that we actually want to see a change in. Is it well-being? Is it burnout? Is it productivity? Is it role clarity? Is it these upstream factors that we're trying to address by our good culture and our leadership training? Maybe those are the ones we need to focus on. So clarify what you're measuring. And engagement surveys are great, but engagement is a really vague and broad term. So what you're actually looking for, where do you want to shift the lever and have some differences? Be specific about that. And there's so many good measures. Somebody asked about how to measure things. There are really good, not expensive measures that will tell you these things. But first of all, define what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I think it's around, organizations measure so many things. My advice is always, in the first instance, put on a culture lens, put on a well-being lens. What is this data telling you? Ask the right questions, and don't just look at the quantitative data. Get the qualitative. What are the stories behind this? Ask questions, talk to people, because you can get an indicator of this through productivity measures, financial measures, brand and reputation, customer satisfaction measures. All of these will link back to an employee measure. And when I do culture assessments or culture audits, we also ask. We measure emotions. We measure descriptors of culture. We actually get to actually look at what is that emotional impact, and that can tell us a huge amount if we're seeing a lot of overwhelm or exhaustion, or if we're seeing a lot of happiness and belonging. So using the descriptors words around how do you describe the workplace and the impact on emotions can be a really great way to understand the impact.
I like that. That's a really good way to get at and get to know the employees a little bit better. Yeah,
and it highlights where the root causes are very easily.
It's a great note to finish on. Just for those, thank you very much, everyone participating. Thank you very much for your questions. A number of questions have come through around survey options, ways to do initiatives in certain use cases, what to do. My suggestion would be very much the survey that Sean's going to remind us about in a second, to connect with Georgia and with Katarina, and they'll be able to help link you with some of those resources and respond to those.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lloyd. So that brings us to the end, everybody. Please feel free to connect with our presenters today, Georgia, Lloyd, and Katarina. I'm sure they will look forward to your connection. And as Lloyd said, if you'd like to be put in touch with any of the team, please indicate your interest on the survey at the end of the webinar as you exit. So you'll receive an email from me. It'll be tomorrow morning now, which will include a recording of today's webinar, the presentation slides, and a copy of the transcript. You'll also have a view of our library and our many other webinars and their resources at the link below. So that includes a history of all of our past webinars. You're free to have a look through. So thank you again, everybody, for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the session today. I know I did. Thanks, Georgia, Lloyd, and Katarina, for your conversation again today. It was really great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.